On September 3, 1945, in a humid clearing near the outskirts of Hosur, India, a convoy of American military trucks came to a sudden halt. Inside, huddled together in silence, were 22 Japanese women, their eyes hollow, uniforms tattered, hearts steeled for what they believed would be the beginning of pain, interrogation, and disgrace. They were prisoners now, relics of a fallen empire. The war had ended just days before, and these women had surrendered with the remnants of their unit. As the truck doors creaked open, many braced for shouting, for blows, even for death. Instead, they were met not with hostility, but with gentle English voices, offering water, bread, and a bewildering phrase none of them expected to hear: "You are safe now." The air was thick with uncertainty, the scent of dust and diesel oil mixing with something else, confusion. The kind that comes when reality refuses to match fear. The camp was unlike anything they had imagined. Rows of khaki tents stood beneath a line of mango trees, their leaves shimmering in the afternoon light. The guards wore expressions that hinted at routine more than menace, and the only barking came from the sun-sick dogs dozing near the mess hall. Yoko Nishida, just 23 and newly widowed by the war, clutched the collar of her uniform tightly as she stepped down, unsure whether to walk tall or shrink away. A nurse with warm eyes handed her a clean blanket. Another pressed small cakes of soap into her palm. She didn't know whether to cry or run. A few women refused to move, expecting a cruel trick, but the kindness endured, steady and incomprehensible. One soldier, barely older than Yoko, knelt down and spoke in halting Japanese. "There are classes tomorrow. English class, you can come." The words fell like unfamiliar rain, soft but jarring onto minds still braced for thunder. Night fell quickly, as it often did in southern India, pulling a velvet curtain over the horizon and casting the camp in deep cobalt shadows. The women lay on army cots, some in quiet prayer, others staring up at canvas ceilings that flapped with the sighs of warm monsoon winds. Yoko listened to the soft murmurs around her, whispers in Kansai dialect and muffled sobs echoing faintly through the makeshift barracks. A girl named Emiko, just 17, turned to Yoko and asked in a trembling voice, "Will they come for us at night?" Yoko didn't know the answer. No one did. But the guards didn't lock them in. That detail lingered in everyone's mind. No chains, no bars, just silence and the hum of crickets outside. At midnight, a radio somewhere crackled alive, playing Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade. American music drifting through the thin canvas walls, unnerving, tender, surreal. They had been ready for cruelty, but instead they were met with lullabies. By morning, the women awoke not to shouting but to the clang of a bell and the faint smell of rice porridge simmering in the field kitchen. A line had already formed near a collapsible chalkboard propped against a crate, where a tall woman in a Red Cross armband wrote the English alphabet in broad, deliberate strokes. The concept of attending classes as prisoners felt absurd, even dangerous, but curiosity proved stronger than doubt. Yoko joined Emiko and 3 others sitting cross-legged on an old tarpaulin. The instructor smiled gently, speaking slowly. A, B, C. The women mimicked the sounds like children relearning how to speak. With every syllable, fear gave way to something stranger, interest. When she glanced up, Yoko saw one of the American guards leaning against a tree, watching them not with suspicion but with distant, unreadable sadness. The war had torn nations apart, but here, under a rusting sky, strangers were quietly teaching each other how to utter words instead of wounds. Later that day, as clouds gathered on the horizon and the air thickened with the scent of wet earth, an unexpected visitor arrived at the camp, Major Harold Lansing, a U.S. military intelligence officer assigned to assess Japanese war prisoners. His uniform was crisp, but his steps betrayed years of field fatigue. The women stiffened as he entered the learning area, a clipboard pressed to his chest. Whispers fluttered like moths. Was this the man who would begin the interrogations? Lansing paused before the class, watching as Emiko stumbled over an English vowel. Then, in careful Japanese, he said, "I came expecting spies. Instead, I find students." His words were not a joke, nor a reprimand, just fact. He didn't stay long, but his visit marked something subtle and irreversible recognition. These women were no longer just prisoners. They were people again, rebuilding an identity syllable by syllable. And that terrified some more than captivity ever had. That night, Yoko sat with Emiko beneath the mango trees, their hands folded around steaming cups of barley tea. Thunder rolled softly against the distant hills, and the damp wind carried with it the mingled scents of rain and human breath. Emiko spoke of Hiroshima, of the sudden white light, of her brother's silhouette burned into a wall. Yoko listened, her own memories stirring like dust from the floorboards of her mind. Her husband's final letter, the silence after Tokyo's last air raid, the way the earth shook not from bombs but from absence. Around them, laughter floated up from a group of women trading English phrases like borrowed currency. "Tomorrow we learn numbers," someone said. Yoko looked up at the sky, blank and endless, and found herself whispering an English word she barely understood. Hope. She didn't trust it yet, didn't dare. But in that moment, beneath a foreign tree, it was the only word large enough to carry her pain. 2 weeks passed, and the camp began to change, or perhaps it was the women who changed. They no longer flinched at the sound of boots on gravel. They no longer waited for punishment after laughter. In the mornings they studied verbs and grammar. In the afternoons they folded laundry, peeled vegetables for stew, and tended a small patch of herbs near the infirmary. It was menial, but it was human. A structure to replace the chaos. One afternoon, an American officer laid down a stack of old philosophy books on a crude bench. Plato, Descartes, even Basho translated. One woman, Misaki, who had taught literature before the war, sat cross-legged and read aloud until her voice trembled with memory. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she recited a haiku from youth. The words no longer spoke of duty or empire. They spoke of seasons, of change, of waiting. Each day peeled away a layer of fear, though none dared say it aloud. What if this peace was temporary? What if freedom, like the empire they had believed in, was just another illusion? That evening, as lanterns flickered in the twilight and the mango leaves cast lacework shadows across the tented ground, a new announcement rippled through the ranks. The camp would soon host a performance night. Not military drills, not forced labor, but poetry, song, and stories offered freely even to prisoners. The women were stunned. Was it a game, a test? But the guards meant it. A makeshift stage was assembled beside the mess hall using wooden planks and truck tarps. For 3 nights, anticipation hung in the air like incense. The prisoners rehearsed in hushed corners, scribbled lyrics on scraps of ration paper, and stitched together faded uniforms into costumes. When the first evening arrived, the air buzzed with equal parts fear and longing. Emiko performed a lullaby her mother used to sing, her voice cracking like rice paper. And when applause followed real, human applause, the illusion of war collapsed for a moment. In its place, something more fragile bloomed, the desperate, furious will to be seen as more than the side that lost. In the quiet aftermath of the final performance, long after the fireflies had retreated and only the rustle of canvas interrupted the stillness, Lansing returned. This time he didn't come with a clipboard or a translator. He stood silently at the edge of the open-air stage, watching the women gather scattered papers and fold away the borrowed magic of the night. Yoko noticed him and, without thinking, rose and approached. No guards intervened. There was no need. She asked him timidly what would happen next. Lansing paused, then replied in English, first slow, deliberate, then in Japanese. "That's not for me to decide, but the world is changing. What you choose to carry forward is..." The words lingered. Not a promise, not a threat, just a choice. And in that moment, as monsoon winds coiled once more through the trees and blew open a tent flap like an unseen door, Yoko realized the war had taken everything from them but not their right to begin again. In the weeks that followed, the line between prisoner and person blurred further. The women began teaching as well as learning. They introduced the Americans to Japanese songs, shared family recipes when ingredients allowed, and taught a few guards how to write their names in katakana. The war had cracked open their world, exposing its rawest edges, but in this strange post-war purgatory, Moments of shared humanity slipped quietly through the cracks. One morning the camp received a message repatriation would begin soon. Names would be called, departures arranged. For many, it was a relief. For some, especially the younger ones like Emiko, it was terrifying. Where would they go? Who waited for them? Yoko sat alone beneath the mango tree one final time, legs tucked beneath her, staring at the curling edge of paper where she had drawn the Roman alphabet just weeks before. Soldiers could lose wars. Empires could fall. But in a place no one marked on maps, a small group of women had rediscovered something the war had tried to erase. Their voice, their future. The silence of war had ended, but what echoed after was not a scream. It was a beginning. The first names were called in the heat of early October. One by one, women stepped forward to receive their repatriation orders, written in languages that still felt foreign. The farewells were quiet, not because there wasn't emotion, but because words had begun to mean more, had begun to cut and to heal at once. Emiko clung to Yoko as if letting go would unmake everything they had rebuilt. "Write to me," she said, even though neither was sure where they would live, or if a letter could ever find its way through the ruins of two broken nations. As Yoko stepped aboard the transport truck that would take her toward the coast, she looked back at the camp, not at the tents or the men, but at the trees. The chalkboard, the tarpaulin whispered with grammar rules. A prison, yes, but also a womb, unexpected and strange, from which she now emerged carrying not just loss but story. A story she would carry and guard for the rest of her life. Years later, when the world had shifted again and the war was turned into pages inside textbooks, Yoko sat beneath a maple tree in Kyoto, older now, slower, but still carrying that same folded piece of paper with her name written in English. She never forgot the sound of Emiko's voice at the edge of the stage, or the weight of Lansing's words as the wind took them. People asked her about the war, and she spoke of fire and hunger, of grief and silence. But when they asked about captivity, she told them instead about the chalkboard beneath mango trees, about Glenn Miller playing through canvas walls, about learning how to say thank you in a language she had once feared. The world had not offered justice. It had not explained why some lived and others vanished. But in that camp, far from home and all its ruins, she had found a strange kind of mercy. Not loud, not triumphant, but real. The kind that does not shout but endures. And still, across oceans of time and the changing faces of decades, that thin border between enemy and human, between prisoner and person, never quite left her. In the quiet hours of morning before the Kyoto streets stirred awake, she would sometimes hold that old paper, its edges browned with age, and trace the faded letters of her English name. Not Yoko the enemy, not Yoko the widow. Simply Yoko, a woman who had once sat terrified in the back of a truck, heart clenched with fear, and had instead been given a pencil, a word, a beginning. She knew now what mercy looked like. It was not the absence of justice nor the denial of loss. It was the fragile, flickering space in between, where the shadow of war could not extinguish the light of learning. And though the empire she had served was long gone, Yoko carried with her a truth vast enough to outlive flags that in the quiet, improbable moments between history's violence, strangers had chosen to be kind. Now, in museums and classrooms, behind glass display cases and beneath carefully typed placards, war is folded into timelines and abstractions. Yet somewhere between the uniform on display and the cold statistics of surrender lies the memory of mango leaves and ink-smudged vowels. Yoko never called herself a survivor. She did not relish the term. But she remembered. She remembered Emiko's laugh echoing through tarpaulin walls. She remembered the smell of barley tea steeping in chipped enamel cups. Most of all, she remembered the moment when a uniformed man in a foreign land said, with no weapon, "You choose what to carry forward." That choice stayed tucked within her, a compass forged not from ideology but from phrases shared and kindness given. The ghost of captivity never vanished, but neither did the melody that once floated between canvas tents. In the aftermath of obliteration, it had not been vengeance or victory that gave shape to the future. It had been a chalkboard, a lullaby, and the quiet, defiant act of learning within walls built for loss, not hope. There is no monument for what happened in Hosur. No plaque, no statue. Only fading records, the occasional diary entry, and the rare voice brave enough to speak softly amid the roar of history. Yoko passed away in the spring of 1996, her belongings catalogued with quiet reverence by her grandchildren. Among them a worn envelope, inside which lay the same sheet of paper with her name written in two scripts, one of blood and one of choice. Emiko's lullaby, recorded once on a crackling cassette, now lives online, shared by her daughter with the caption, "She sang this when she first believed the war was truly over." These fragments, too delicate for textbooks, endure in forgotten corners, passed quietly between generations. Not grand triumphs, but small defiance. Proof that even behind barbed wire and beneath mango trees, compassion can take root. And maybe that is the cruelest irony of war, that in trying to break the human spirit, it sometimes reveals its deepest strength. So the story remains, not in headlines or medals, but in the quiet corners where memory nestles. A woman's whispered English in a Kyoto garden. A lullaby preserved through static and time. A name once feared, now spoken in peace. These were the echoes left behind by a few forgotten prisoners who thought captivity would end them, but instead were given the space to reclaim their humanity. Their tale is not one of glory nor of absolution, but of the brittle, luminous courage it takes to learn again when the world expects you to shatter. The ghosts of Hosur do not march in parades or stand carved in stone. They live in every classroom where compassion is chosen over vengeance, where a word replaces a weapon. And perhaps that is the lesson history seldom tells, that the fiercest resistance in the face of ruin is not might or pride, but the gentle, stubborn will to begin again. In the decades since, researchers and historians have unearthed fragments of similar episodes in scattered burial grounds of history, internment camps, holding centers, forgotten way stations between war and peace. But none quite mirrored Hosur. That camp, with its sunburnt mango trees and its improbable classrooms, became a quiet symbol not of victory, but of what can flourish in the shadow of defeat. No single government claimed its kindness. No official narrative embraced its contradiction. But among letters stored in attics and whispers passed between survivors, the memory endured. Yoko's grandchildren would later pen essays not about battles but about grammar lessons beneath canvas roofs. And beyond them, somewhere, a child in a distant classroom learns to say "arigato" and then "thank you" in turn, unaware that these syllables once stitched together fractured souls. We map war in trenches and treaties, but some of its deepest scars and softest salvations live in the unmarked places between. And maybe, just maybe, that is where humanity survives. Somewhere in southern India, the mango trees still stand, their leaves shifting in the same warm wind that once carried fear, then music, then learning through rows of canvas tents. The world may have erased the lines drawn by that quiet camp, but its truth remains indelible in those who lived it and those who inherited their stories. In a faraway library, a faded diary rests beneath a pane of glass. Yoko's handwriting faint in places, yet firm where she once traced the letters of a foreign language that offered her a lifeline. In each fragile page, she retold a story that was never about sides or surrender, but about what happens when the walls of enmity crack just enough for a lesson, a lullaby, a name to slip through. And perhaps that is the final legacy of Hosur, not silence but a voice, carried forward not by power, but by the quiet resolve to remember and to be remembered as more than prisoners, as more than war, as human. None of them returned to Hosur. There were no reunions, no official visits, no ceremonies honoring the quiet evolution that had once taken root beneath its sun-seared skies. But in private moments, in journal entries and dreams and soft retellings to curious grandchildren, those weeks surfaced again like ripples on still water. Yoko's son later confessed that as a boy he had once found her kneeling beside the garden at dawn, whispering words in English to herself as though reciting prayers. She never taught a class nor gave testimony at tribunals. She left no grand statements. Only a folded paper, a line of script, and a haunting reminder of what it meant to survive not by resisting cruelty, but by accepting a fragile kindness. So when the world counts its battles and lines its dead, let it also remember this, that behind the quiet canvas walls of an unnamed camp, the fiercest act of defiance was learning how to begin again, quietly, together. In a century bruised by war and scarred by memory, it is easy to overlook the places that never made the maps, to forget that sometimes the most enduring revolutions happen in the hearts of those whom history did not expect to endure. Hosur was never meant to shape legacy, only to process prisoners and move on. Yet within its fleeting span, something vital flickered, the soft resistance of empathy, the radical idea that even those who once wore the enemy's colors could learn, laugh, remember. What happened there did not end the war. It did not absolve the crimes or erase the pain. But it did offer a moment carved in sunlight and syllables, when strangers chose to be more than wardens and captives. And though the camp itself has long vanished, if you listen closely beneath the rustling of mango leaves, you may still hear it. The echo of a forgotten classroom, the breath of unspoken forgiveness, the whisper of a name once feared, now free. No archives list Hosur among the pivotal places that shaped the Second World War. No textbooks chart its significance, yet its quiet legacy endures not in statistics or speeches, but in the soft etchings of memory, the vulnerable testament of transformation amid devastation. It was never about redemption nor forgetting the atrocities that marked the war's trail. It was about what remained after the possibility that even in institutions built to strip identity, a chalkboard and a lullaby could defy intent. When war erased boundaries with blood, humanity redrew them through language, small gestures, the audacity to believe in kindness. Yoko's folded paper, Emiko's whispered song, Lansing's brief pause, these were not grand historical moments. They were threads in a tapestry of resistance written not in bold slogans but in learned syllables and returned smiles. Hosur's story does not end with a fade to silence. It ends with a beginning still echoing, still remembered, still enough. So if you ever find yourself wandering through the outskirts of Hosur, where the sun still presses down like memory and the mango trees sway as if whispering old names, know that you stand on unmarked ground that once held more than prisoners. It held the remnants of an empire, yes, but also the fragile spark of rebirth. Without stone statues or brass plates, this place remembers differently. Its legacy lives in unseen roots, in forgotten dialects exchanged under canvas skies, in the resilience of women who expected to be broken but discovered voices instead. No sirens wailed when they chose to begin again. No flags were raised. Only a bell rang for class. Only a pencil scratched a name into possibility. History may overlook Hosur, but the human story does not. It lives in the soft insistence that healing can follow horror, that a name spoken in kindness can outlast the silence of war. And sometimes that is enough, that is everything. In the stillness of that imagined classroom beneath mango trees, where syllables once stitched together the broken fabric of identity, the unspoken final lesson endured. It was not written into any book nor captured in any photograph, but it whispered through generations in quiet acts of decency. In the choice to greet a stranger with grace instead of suspicion. Yoko and the others had emerged from war not unscarred, but unextinguished carriers of a truth deeper than any victor's anthem. That even when empires fall and the maps are redrawn, the human spirit writes its own geography in kindness, in memory, in the quiet act of learning the language of forgiveness. Hosur left no monuments, only echoes in the souls of those who passed through it. And in those echoes, long after the last tape-recorded lullaby fades, the story remains legible not in history's grand chapters but in the soft, persistent line that separates fear from hope and chooses again and again to cross it. And so the chalkboard beneath the mango trees becomes the final image. Not grand but true, a symbol of fragile defiance in the face of history's weight. For those Japanese women who arrived at Hosur wrapped in shame and fear, what they found was not absolution but an open page. They were never meant to be more than shadows, faceless remnants of a war the world wanted to forget. But through shared language and hesitant trust, they became more. They became teachers of peace and students of mercy, their lives an unwritten footnote that still hums beneath the silence of missing memorials. When all else fades, the uniforms, the speeches, the lines of battle, what remains is this: the moment a lost voice finds a word, the moment a prisoner chooses to hope. And in the quiet corners where this story is still passed, Mango leaves sway gently, whispering a name once whispered in fear, now spoken freely, softly, again. There are no parades for the peacemakers, no drum rolls for those who dared believe in gentleness after war. But if Hosur taught the world anything, it is that healing arrives not in grand declarations, but in quiet invitations, a pencil offered to a shaking hand, a lullaby sung where silence was expected, a name written not to label but to humanize. Long after the bombs ceased and treaties were signed, its story lingers in unlikely places, in the hush of a classroom, in the tender pause before anger, in the decision to teach where history said punish. These women, forgotten by politics and untouched by medals, became part of a deeper legacy, one that whispers beneath mango trees and echoes in the space between what was lost and what might still be found. And perhaps that is the truest victory, not in conquering one another but in choosing even once to write peace into the margins of war. They came bearing the weight of defeat, and yet departed with something heavier, the burden of remembrance. Those women, 22 souls carried into the unknown aboard a truck bound for Hosur, never asked to be symbols. But history, in its relentless unfolding, sometimes selects its witnesses not by power but by what they choose in silence. And they chose to learn, to listen, to humanize those taught to be enemies. Now, as time records louder names and greater devastations, the quiet lesson of Hosur endures on the breath of those who dare to imagine another way. In a world still marred by war, the softest legacy comes not from treaties but from tarpaulins echoing with new words, from lullabies sung into uncertainty, from women once counted only as captives who raised pencils instead of flags. Their story closes not with an answer but a question that lingers like dusk beneath mango leaves. What do we carry forward, when the world wants only to forget? Perhaps in the end, the true testament to Hosur's quiet upheaval lies not in remembering all its names, but in recognizing the echo it left in places the world never meant to change. It is found not in the clasp of medals or the lines on monuments but in something smaller, more enduring, a teacher pausing in a modern classroom, sensing the weight behind a simple thank you murmured by a student whose grandmother once learned it in captivity. It is there, in the breath before judgment, in the silence after violence, where humanity still chooses to speak softly. The chalkboard beneath the mango trees may be gone, but its lesson remains etched in those who lived it and all who dare to choose mercy over memory, to offer words where the world once offered only war. That lesson, like the fading scent of rain on sun-warmed earth, lingers, and in that lingering, the story and its truth endures. Some stories demand retelling not through textbooks or tributes but through the simple act of listening. Hosur was never written as a headline. It asked nothing, no glory, no recompense. But in the quiet dusk between empire and exile, a few women scribbled resilience across the blank slate of captivity. Their voices, once muffled by war, now live in the tender spaces where history rarely lingers. In a word learned without punishment, a name spoken without fear, a song remembered through silence. We may walk past places like Hosur 1,000 times without knowing what soil we stand on. But if we pause, if we choose to listen, we might hear what those 22 women once heard through canvas walls and cracked loudspeakers, not victory, not vengeance, but the echo of peace spoken softly enough to reach even the wounded. That in the end is what remains, not the war, but the will to begin again, under mango trees, with nothing but a name and the strength to speak it. So let the final chapter of Hosur not be one of silence, but of deep listening, a moment stretched across decades, passed hand to hand in memories too delicate for archives. Long after the tents vanished and uniforms turned to dust, its story survives not because it was loud, but because it was true. For in a world that so often glorifies destruction, Hosur whispered of the radical act of rebuilding with words, not weapons. It stands as a fragile beacon in the fog of war, reminding us that even in the shadow of empire's collapse, there can emerge something luminous. A classroom of captives who dared to believe learning could be defiance, and kindness a revolution. And though history may not record their names in gold, they remain in every whispered thank you, every taught word passed in peace. Not forgotten. Not erased. Just quietly waiting, beneath the rustling of mango trees, for someone to remember. And so, in the quiet rustle of mango trees and the warm hush that lingers in stories seldom told, Hosur becomes less a place and more a question of what we remember, and why. It is the question Yoko's granddaughter asks when she runs her fingers over worn paper, and wonders why her grandmother spoke English with a softness too deliberate to be accidental. It is the question that lives in the breath between syllables exchanged by children learning languages that once divided their bloodlines. In the end, Hosur's legacy is not carved in stone but carried in voices, in songs without choruses, in lessons that do not seek applause. It lives because it hums gently, persistently in the unseen places, asking not to be celebrated but to be believed. And perhaps that is how peace truly endures, not as a triumph shouted into history, but as a story whispered long after the last mango leaf falls. In a century swollen with sorrow, where headlines catalog ruin and victory in equal measure, Hosur answers a different call. It reminds us that within the soft hours between surrender and return, something sacred can emerge, not cure, not justice, but shared breath, unguarded learning, fragile understanding. What those 22 women carried forward was not just memory but a compass of resilience, pointing gently toward the radical idea that even captives can choose their legacy. And in that choice, whispered across generations, scattered in lullabies and faded ink, they have outlived the silence. Not in grand hallways of power, but in the smaller spaces we seldom look. A classroom smile, a trembling new word, a hand offering a pencil instead of punishment. Hosur, though unnamed by history, etched itself into the soul of what remains when war has burned away everything else. A voice, a lesson, a name said not in fear but in peace. That is its quiet revolution, that is its truth. And so we leave it here, not in triumph, but in testament to those who once stepped down from a truck bracing for torment, and instead found the unthinkable. A piece of their future returned to them, syllable by fragile syllable. Hosur is not on battle maps or in war memoirs, but it lingers in the gentle insistence that history is shaped not only by conquest, but by kindness offered in its aftermath. In their silence, those 22 women taught the world how healing begins not with treaties but with trust, not with declarations but with dialogue. They showed us that even in the wreckage of empire, something new can take root, tender, trembling but alive. And if we listen, truly listen, then maybe Hosur was never just a camp. Maybe it was a beginning hidden inside an ending, a question asked softly through time. What else might grow if we dared to teach peace where the world demanded war? The mango trees still sway, untouched by the noise of history, their leaves casting dappled memories across earth that once bore witness to the softest defiance. There are no more cots beneath their shade, no tarpaulins whispering with chalk dust and conjugated hope. But somewhere in the hush that follows wind, a name is spoken again, not in fear, not in command, but with reverence. Yoko, Emiko, all of them, not prisoners, not footnotes, but women who met the aftermath of war not with vengeance but with open hands and aching hearts ready to learn. And perhaps that is how the great silences are resolved, not all at once, not in thunder, but in a single shared word. A lesson remembered. A kindness returned. Hosur was never meant to be remembered, yet it was. And in that quiet truth, passed like breath from one soul to another, the final syllable of peace is still being written. That final syllable drifts not through parades or proclamations, but through the barely audible spaces where mercy once found a voice. In the long hush of history's wake, the tale of Hosur resists erasure not by force, but by resonance, in a lullaby humming over tea, in a chalkboard reimagined by memory, in a woman who once feared her name and later taught it to her grandchildren with pride. For those who listen not with urgency but with reverence, the story endures. It does not end on a date or fold neatly into a headline. It persists in perhaps the possibility that somewhere, even now under unfamiliar trees or inside a quiet classroom, someone speaks a word once learned in chains and now carried in freedom. That is the legacy the war tried to drown but could not silence. A word, a name, a choice, spoken gently, heard completely, and remembered forever beneath the mango trees. So perhaps it was never the barbed wire or the uniforms or the silence that defined Hosur, but the moment a woman sat down broken and unsure, and was offered a pencil instead of punishment. That small gesture, quiet, unrecorded, became the genesis of a deeper kind of resistance, not the defiance of arms but of understanding, not the conquest of land, but of fear. In that instant the war's grip loosened, and something fragile but fierce took root. And even now, in a world still at odds with itself, where flags rise faster than understanding, that pencil remains symbolic not of innocence regained but of humanity reclaimed. Under mango trees and within memories too delicate for plaques, the unheard syllable continues. A word, a name, a lesson whispered across decades, not to shout peace but to teach it, endlessly, gently, and always just enough to be remembered. And now, as the mango trees rustle in winds that care nothing for borders, time, or flags, the final breath of this story slips softly into the spaces beyond history's gaze. It asks not for recognition, only remembrance that somewhere amid the cracked mosaic of wartime memory, a quiet camp once transformed captives into students, grief into grace, endings into uncertain, hopeful beginnings. Hosur was not salvation, it was a pause, a breath, a fragile refusal to let war decide everything. And in that breath, held still within the hearts of those who left and the children they raised in peace, the story lives on, not loudly, not clearly, but unmistakably. In every hand that chooses a pencil over a weapon, in every voice that dares to speak gently where cruelty once reigned, Hosur endures not as a place, but as a lesson. One last syllable, spoken not to conquer but to remember. Soft, human, enough. And so, let the last word rest not in textbooks or tongues of brass but between the folds of memory. In that silent classroom beneath mango trees where captives reclaimed something the war had stripped away: their names, their voices, their right to be more than history's debris. Hosur was not meant to matter, but it did. And in its quiet refusal to follow the script of vengeance, it became something rare, a moment of mercy powerful enough to echo beyond time. When all banners fade, when maps are redrawn again and again, the whisper of that place remains not in the language of war, but in the fragile grammar of hope. A name spoken tenderly, a word written gently, a lesson passed on not to forget but to remember differently. And in that remembering, maybe, just maybe, we begin again. Beneath those mango trees, time has scattered petals of memory rather than stones of glory. And even as their names fade from official records, the legacy of Hosur endures in every quiet act that defies history's expected arc. A woman sitting beside a child teaching a language once feared. A song hummed while making tea, its origin half forgotten but its warmth intact. These are not the spoils of war but the offerings of peace, fragile, flickering, yet eternal. Hosur did not end a war. It did not erase its scars. But in that suspended space between surrender and return, it offered something that still asks to be heard, that when given the chance, even those marked as enemies can choose another path, not by rewriting history, but by writing their names anew, gently, on a shared page. And if that page survives, deep in the hush beneath rustling leaves, then so too does the truth that peace, though quiet, is never truly forgotten. And maybe, just maybe, that is where Hosur truly lives now, not in geography or ceremony, but in the human refusal to forget what kindness can remake. Though time has frayed the canvas and dulled the footsteps that once traced its soil, its memory endures in every soul who understands that peace is not the absence of war, but the quiet continuation of compassion. It survives every time a name is spoken with care, every time a lesson begins not with conquest but with listening. Beneath mango trees long grown wild, where language once bridged the unbridgeable, the women of Hosur still speak in lullabies, in syllables recited through tears, in the unshakable courage it takes to begin again. And as their story folds gently into the deeper history of what it means to be human, one truth remains unmistakable. The war ended, but they chose what came after. And that choice, quiet, brave, enduring, is the word that lingers still.